Hi, Leslie here, and in today's video I would like to talk about the sacking of Baghdad in 1258 by the Mongols, which brought to end the Abbasid dynasty. I would like to point out a parallel, first of all, that this was not the last, as it were, sacking of Baghdad. In fact, we have witnessed in recent years what could be called a second sacking of Baghdad in 2003 during the so-called War on Terror, except that in this case it wasn't the Mongols who sacked Baghdad, so to speak, but rather the coalition of the forces led by the United States. The purpose of this coalition was allegedly to overthrow the Saddam Hussein because of the allegation that he possessed or was in the process of developing weapons of mass destruction. Now, even though this allegation was proven to be problematic in retrospect, in fact, there's an alternative perception on what truly transpired on 9/11, and one account may be found in the work of Dr. David Ray Griffin, who has written quite a few books on the subject since, I believe, his first one, which was titled The New Pearl Harbor. And in this book he explains basically that the attack on Iraq and Afghanistan was part of the so-called neoconservative agenda which was expressed in a document called the Project for a New American Century. And perhaps I could add also that General Wesley Clark also supports the perception that there was a predetermined plan to go into the Middle East and change the governments of up to 7 countries in the region. Now, this information may be found on YouTube. Also, we can find videos made by similar groups, such as the website of Jim Fetzer and quite a few other activists, the so-called truthers, who have been advocating an alternative perception as to what truly transpired on that fateful day. I think it may be enough for the layman simply to recall that on 9/11, altogether 3 buildings collapsed, yet only 2 of them were hit by an aircraft. So that leaves an unanswered question. How did the 3rd building collapse when it was not hit by any airplane? I think something doesn't add up here, does it? But anyway, to come back to the main question, the sacking of Baghdad in 1258, we can observe that one reason for this sacking was, I think, what could be described as the irrational treatment of foreigners or irrational foreign policies by the authorities of the time. I mean, when you look on YouTube and watch some of these YouTube sheikhs give an account of this attack on the Muslim Abbasid Empire by the Mongol Empire, you will probably hear things like, oh well, the Muslims were attacked for absolutely no reason at all. I have heard that those very words from one of the commentators. Now, it is true that Muslims were attacked, but whether they were attacked for absolutely no reason at all, I think is very far from what really happened on that day. Let me read a quotation from a book by a fellow called Syed Abul Hasan Ali Nadwi. The book is called Lessons of the Crusades and the Mongol Hordes. It was published by the Islamic Book Trust in Malaysia in 2006, and the quotation itself is found on page 49. So this is what this historian had to say about the cause of the Mongol invasion. I quote, "The immediate cause of the Mongol invasion can be attributed to a grievous mistake of Alauddin Muhammad, the Shah of Khwarism, A body of traders who had arrived from Mongolia was put to death, and when Genghis Khan deputed an embassy to inquire into the reasons for it, Muhammad replied by killing the envoy too. On receiving the news of this outrage upon international courtesy, the Mongol Khakan Chengiz Khan let loose the whirlwind of savagery upon the world of Islam. End of quote. So now it seems that the attack by the Mongols against the Abbasid dynasty did not simply happen for no reason at all, but it happened for a very serious outrage and also breach of diplomacy and diplomatic immunity that is normally granted to foreign emissaries. I would like to point out that World War I started for less than what happened here. World War I was triggered by the assassination of the Archduke of Sarajevo and his wife. About 20 million people lost their lives in World War I. Now, this attack by the Mongol Empire was a response to a twofold provocation by the rulers of the Abbasid Empire at the time. This act was not only highly un-Islamic, which teaches, we know that Islam teaches good manners and being polite to foreigners and never aggressing and never fighting except in self-defense, and even then under certain conditions. So this act was not only highly un-Islamic, if you like, but also highly irrational. So who in his right mind would do such a thing and not expect any consequences to take place? Now, I would like to suggest that this kind of behavior by the leadership of the Muslims at the time reflects certain strands of thinking, or perhaps lack of thinking, in the way they understood Islam and the way in which they applied it. The strand that I'm talking about is basically anti-rationalism. And we know that this strand was there from almost the very beginning. Anti-rationalism in Islam, I think, arose at the time of the struggles between the so-called rationalists or the Mu'tazilites on the one hand, and the traditionists or the so-called people of tradition or al-Hadith on the other. Now, this struggle or contest centered around the question of which was better suited to explain revelation. Was it reason or was it tradition? Now, of course, the rationalists promoted the use of reason in understanding revelation, while the traditionists promoted the use of tradition to achieve the same end. Now, what happened was that things came to a head, and there was a confrontation between the rationalists and the traditionists. And this confrontation resulted in the so-called massacre of up to 5,000 philosophers by Musa al-Hadi in the year 786, on the grounds that these people were heretics and disbelievers, and that therefore they had to be eradicated. Now, this mass murder of the philosophers was reported by Jalaluddin al-Afghani in his debate with the French Orientalist Renan. And Afghani quoted in his statement the work of al-Suyuti, who was the first, I believe, who reported this event in writing to the readers, whoever would be, whoever was studying Muslim history at the time. So now, what I'm trying to say is that there was a huge bias against rationality, and to the point where thinking itself began to, or appeared to be considered as a crime. Free thinkers were considered as un-Islamic, and in fact they were called zindiq or zandaka. And this event, incidentally, is very seldom highlighted in Muslim academic circles. I am quite puzzled as to why that is the case. Should we not learn from the mistakes of the past and not to repeat them? Well, it seems that in the case of Saddam Hussein, he and his followers did not appear to learn very much from the past, because they appeared to repeat pretty much the same mistake as Khwarism Shah made at the time just before the invasion by the Mongols. So there was someone who said that those who are not prepared to learn from history are likely to repeat it, and including the mistakes that people have made in history. It seems therefore that we need to pay closer attention to history and draw the necessary lessons. So now the other factors that I believe contributed to the decline of reasoning in the Muslim world included the so-called shutting of the gates of ijtihad or reasoning, which took place in approximately the year 1000. And secondly, also in the denunciation of philosophers by Imam al-Ghazali as heretics and disbelievers, which took place about 100 years after the shutting of the gates to ijtihad or to reasoning. So in other words, we see here a very strong bias against reason and reasoning. And I think this has brought Muslim civilization basically to its knees, and is the first cause of the decline of the Islamic civilization. We also need to remember that by identifying reasoning with kufr or disbelief, as is supported by one particular tradition that is attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, this identification of reasoning with disbelief led to a decline in reasoning, and as a result of the deterioration of reasoning, Muslim exegetes began to understand the revelation of the Quran less and less, until they reached the point where some of the passages of the Quran began to strike them as ambiguous or unclear and even contradictory. Now, in order to address the issue of the lack of clarity of the revelation, they resorted to tradition. In relation to the contradictory passages, the exegetes resorted to the doctrine of abrogation. But the application of both of these methodologies, the use of tradition to explain revelation and the use of abrogation to explain apparent contradictions in revelation, both had very serious effects, and we will explore these effects, I think, in another video. So that for the time being, I think we will leave our analysis at this point and simply conclude that in order for the Muslim civilization to, as it were, bounce back, the very first thing that we need to do is to rehabilitate reason or rationality and restore it to its position where it helps us to understand both revelation and tradition, and where it also helps us to understand the proper relationship between revelation, reason, and tradition. So that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.